In this video, I wanted to cover some of the concepts in Access and go over the types of objects that you will use in Access. So I'm going to go in and open my Northwind file, which has information about customers and orders and products and things like that. So you can see it's a .accdb extension, Access database. So if I double click to open it, it's going to open the file. But if I go back in, you can see that now there is another file here. This is a .laccdb file. You can see it has a little lock on it. And if you look, it says it's a record locking information file. It's only maybe 0K or maybe 1K sometimes, but it's a very small file if it has anything in it at all. So this file is only for when the database is open, and it is a temporary file that's created so that you cannot go in and try to edit the same information that someone else is editing at that same time. So it's locking records so that you can't edit the data at the same time as someone else. So if you're going to submit a file, make sure it's the .accdb, not the .laccdb. I cannot open the .laccdb, that locking file. So make sure when you submit a file that you're submitting the correct version. So let's go in here, and this is what your database will look like when you are opening the data. So you have different objects here, and this navigation pane you can choose to see, specific objects, or you can show all of them by just expanding each one. You can go in here to the navigation pane and determine, which ones you want to show here. So if you don't see everything in your navigation pane, you might need to go up to the top to say, I want to see all of the objects by object type. So that means that I'll see all the tables together, queries, forms, and reports together. Okay, so if you wanted to open something over here in your objects pane, you would just double click on it. So in Access, one thing I wanted to point out is that when you go in to save your database, let's say if you do a save as, okay, if you do a save as, you want to save it under a different file name, that's fine. You would just save as and choose that Access database, okay. Note, you can also back up your database here and it will create a backup copy. If you have an object, such as a report open, and you have that selected, it will say save object as, and it will save just that report. So save database as, if you choose this option, and you can save it under a different file name or to a different place like your USB drive. You can save everything in the database that way, okay? Otherwise, if you have edited something, let's just go in and I'm just going to put a space there so that it knows I've made an edit. The save button will appear, and that means that there's data that you haven't saved or some change that you haven't saved. So when you click on save, it saves the entire database. It saves what I changed, it saves all of the tables, queries, forms, and reports, everything together. So you don't have to save everything separately to a separate file. It all goes in one file. Okay. Also in Access, another thing to mention is that the undo does not always work. There are certain things that you might do in Access that you might not be able to undo. Sometimes if you change a data type, for example, for a field, you might not be able to undo that. Okay, so what I would like to do is just go through the objects just to show you what you will be using in Access and sort of how everything works. So your tables hold the data. So if I open my customers table again, just double clicking on it, let's pull that over, I can see my customer data. Okay, the names, the phone numbers, addresses, and so forth. I also have photos here of each one, and those will actually appear later when you've created some forms. But the tables are foundational. You would create those first in a database. It holds the data, And you also set up the structure of the data in the table. So down here you can see that there are 29 records. If I wanted to create a new one, I would just go in and create a new customer down here and type the data in. Or I can go here to this button and create a new record that way. So a table looks a lot like an Excel spreadsheet, right? So you have columns and rows. So in the columns, you have what we call fields. They hold each particular type of data. So it would hold a last name or a first name or a job title. It's a particular type of data. Whereas the rows are called records, okay? Records will hold the values for each of those fields for a particular record. So in this case, each record is a customer, okay? So this table has what we call a sub-data sheet, okay? If you click on that, it's going to show you the order information for each customer. And the reason it does that is because it knows it's related to an orders table, and we can talk about that in a different video. But just so that you know, it's pulling in data from another table to show you that that customer is related to an order. So this is what we call data sheet view. It shows the data, okay? If you go to view, you can click on either one of these, but if you just click on view, it's going to take you to the other view of the table, which is what we call design view, okay? Data sheet view shows the data. The design view shows the design, or what we call the structure of the table. It will show behind each field the data type for each one, and you've got lots of different data types that you would choose from. And if I click in each of these, you'll see that for each field, it will bring up the properties for that field. So for example, if I click on the phone, it has what we call an input mask as a property, which means that it will display it with the specific format, and I'll show you that right here. You can see that it displays it with the parentheses and that dash, okay? So for each field, as you click on it, you have different properties, and that's based on the data type as to what properties will appear. But just know that this is the structure of your table. You can tell it what type of data that's going to hold, and you can tell it, okay, if I want it to be a certain field size so that it can hold more or less data. And then there are other properties we can cover in a different video, which will allow you to format the data and make sure that data might be entered in a certain way, okay? So that's an example of your table in design view. The other thing I want to point out is that you have this little key here, which is called a primary key. The primary key is the unique value in each table. So for customers, there's a customer ID, okay? Each person has a unique customer ID. So that's why we call it a primary key. That will be very important later when you set up the relationships. So every table will have to have a unique primary key that identifies each record in the table, okay? So for employees, you can see that the primary key is the employee ID. Okay, so for each of these tables, you can view it in data sheet view, or you can look at the structure of the table through the design view. Okay, so those are your tables. They hold categories of data in fields and records. So I'm just going to say no, I don't want to save the layout there. Okay, the next thing that's important to set up in your database is what we call the relationships. And they're not necessarily called an object, but it's very important to understand. And we'll talk about this in a different video in more depth. But the relationships, if you look at those under database tools and relationships, it will show you all of the tables in the database and the relationships between those. So this shows you that there's a relationship between the customer and the order through the customer ID field, okay? Same here, for each order, an employee is responsible for that order, so there's a relationship there. So for each order, there are details, which would show every product ordered in each order. So there's a relationship between the order and the order details table through the order ID field. So you note that each of the tables has that primary key, and the primary key is related somehow to another table. Okay, so that's the most depth I want to go into with relationships at the moment. We will have another video on that one, but it's very critical that your tables are set up correctly and that the relationships are set up correctly, because if it's not, the data that you pull from those tables will not be accurate. Okay. The next item or object in a database is a query. A query is used to pull data from a table or more than one table. So, for example, I've created some queries here. Here's one that shows the customer orders. So I've gone in and created a query that will show for each customer all of the order information for each order that the customer has placed. Okay, so just like in the table view, I can go to the view for a table, and I have several different views. I have datasheet view, which is what we're in now. It shows the data, and design view. There's also SQL view, and SQL is structured query language, which means that when you create a query, Access automatically creates what we call SQL code in order to go in and pull the data from those tables. So I'll show you in design view. It's pulling data from the customer table, the orders table, and the order details table. Excuse me. And so you can see each field that we've pulled from each table. You don't have to pull all of the fields from each table, but this just shows you it's just a simple query. It's pulling those fields from each table so that when I run the query, it's going to go into each of those tables and it's going to pull the data that I've requested and it's going to display that data. So just to show you the SQL behind that, and you don't need to really know this, but just know that it works on SQL, structured query language. It automatically creates this for you when you create the query. So it's selecting specific data from specific tables. And that's in SQL code format. Okay, so you don't have to really worry about that. Just know that that's kind of the underlying foundation for queries in Access, is that it's creating that SQL code behind it to create the query. So for example, if I wanted just the discontinued products, a list of those, I created a query, and this is the result of the query, so that it shows only those that are discontinued, which have checks. So if I go into my design view for my query, I can see that I've pulled it just from one table, specific fields, and you can see that I chose discontinued has to be a value of yes in order to pull those in. So we'll talk a little bit more in a different video about how to create queries and how to create the criteria for those so that you pull only the data that you would like. Okay, so every time you run a query, what it's doing is it's going in, and if I double click on it, it's pulling that data fresh every time from the table or tables that I've used to create the query, so that if you've changed any data in the meanwhile, it will go in and pull the fresh data. Okay, notice down here it will tell you also the number of records in your query, and that's something else that we'll discuss later in another video. Okay, next are your forms, and forms and reports are kind of similar, but forms are used mainly to go in and view data and to edit data. So for example, if I wanted to go in for my customers, I created a form so that for the customers, you can see it shows the customer data. Okay, now what I did is I pulled this directly from the customers table, so it's showing all of the fields from the customers table. So I can go in and view this, or I can go in, if I wanted to search for someone, I can go in and do that as well. So for the customers, I have 29, okay, and I can go down here in the navigation and I can navigate through each of these customers, okay. So why would I not just want to go in? If I wanted to edit someone's name, I can edit her name here, and what that will do is also change it in the customers table, because this is pulling in data from the customers table. So when I change it here, it's changing it in the table. The thing is, why don't you just let them go in and change the data in the table? Well, it may be that you have certain personal information you don't want everybody to see. So in a table, they would be able to see that. When you create a form, it allows you to show only the data that's needed in order for the user to go in and edit data. So for example, maybe you have the amount of pay or salary that someone makes. You wouldn't want them to be able to see that necessarily in a form, depending on who's using the form. So in a form, you can pull in only the data that's needed. But a person could go in and view data, you can search for data, you can edit data in your forms. So your reports are similar to your forms, except the reports are used mainly for aggregating data or pulling out just enough data that someone would need to see in a report. Usually you would get a report of totals or some specific data so that you could provide that information to someone else who may be making a business decision based off of that data. So your reports are similar to the forms. You can build a report or a form from either tables or from queries. So I've built a couple of reports down here. One is from the employees table that just lists the employees. And then I have another one that lists the discontinued products. So it's built off of the query here. Okay, so for the discontinued products, you can see that it's showing only those that are discontinued. I can also print one for customer orders. So the reports are just formatted so that someone could look at the data and perhaps make some business decisions based off of that data, or use it for some other specific purpose to make their work more efficient. Okay, so you cannot edit your data in the reports. Whenever you run a report, just like your forms, it's pulling that data fresh from either the query or the table. So if you have a report that's built off of a query, what it will do is it will go in and open the query behind the scenes, and it will, when it opens the query, it's going to go in and pull in the data from the tables that it needs for the query, and then after it's run the query, it will populate that data into the report. So it's a process that's done very quickly behind the scenes. So I hope that will provide an overview of the different objects in Access for you. So there are tables, queries, forms, and reports, and the relationships are used to be able to relate those tables together so that you can pull data for your queries and your other objects.